Hey there, it's Ozzy here at the photomateur.com. Thanks indeed for joining me. As you can see, I'm out in the garden here today, and there is a reason for that. I'm guessing, I don't know because I obviously can't see it at the moment on my screen there, but I'm guessing that this camera is going to really struggle with the dappled light that's coming through the tree here. It's a gloriously sunny day. I'm sitting under a tree, but there's sort of a half light here. I'm guessing that it's going to struggle getting the correct exposure. Now, exposure is actually what this video is going to concentrate on. It's going to be an introduction to the basics of photographic exposure. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not going to stay here, although I'm really tempted to because it is a beautiful day. I'm not going to stay here. I'm going to head on inside and we'll jump on the computer and we'll have a look in more detail there, and I'll see you in a second. So we've stepped inside now and we're going to look at the basics of exposure. So what is a correct exposure? Well, it's actually the correct amount of light reaching the recording medium. Now, there are a huge amount of variables in getting that correct amount of light to reach your recording medium, whether that's film or your digital sensor. Most of what you'll learn in this session can be applied to both film and digital photography. But let's have a look at that. So here we have a light source, cunningly labelled the correct amount, and here we have a crudely drawn lens, and here we have an even more crudely drawn recording medium, and that's your film or the sensor, and it's just getting the correct amount of that light through the lens onto the recording medium, and you will have a correct exposure. So what are those variables that I spoke of? Well, it's often referred to as the exposure triangle. And we'll look at that triangle now. At the pinnacle, we've got what's called ISO. And don't worry about this, we're going to look at each of these individually, so you don't need to remember this at the moment. Just remember that there are 3 points of the triangle, 3 variables, and each affects the other. So we've got ISO, we've got shutter speed, and we've got aperture. And as I've just said, if you make a change to one, it will affect the others. You'll see here, each has an effect on the other. So let's have a look at those individually. ISO. What's ISO? Well, it's an acronym for the International Standards Organization, actually. But in photography, it has come to refer to the speed ratings of film, or indeed the setting on your digital camera. The more sensitive a film is to light, the faster that film is said to be, and as I've just said, the same ratings were adopted for digital sensors. So what are the main ISO ratings? They go up from 100. Now, do bear in mind that these ratings are the standard. These are the main ratings. There are ratings that fall outside of these, and there are intermediate ratings as well, but there's 100, 200, 400, 800, 1600, and 3200, and a lot of digital cameras now go much higher than that, but these are the main ones, and these are the ones that you'll be looking at in film photography. And you'll probably notice that each number is double the previous one. So I mentioned in an earlier video that doubling and halving was something you'd have to get used to in your photography. So 200 is obviously double 100, 400 is obviously double 200, and the same is the other way. It sort of halves each way, so 3200 down to 1600, 1600 down to 800. I know that might be stating the obvious, but it is important that you get this point. As I've said, there are intermediate ISO ratings of films available, and both outside, so lower than 100 and above 3200, and within this range here you'll find intermediate ratings available. So the higher you go up the scale, the faster the film becomes. So 200 is twice as sensitive as 100, 400 is twice as sensitive as 200, and you get the drift all the way up to 3200. So if you've got a nice bright sunny day, 100 will be absolutely fine for you. If at the other end of the scale you're in the depths of gloom and shadow, well, you're probably wanting to get up to around 1600 or even 3200, although there are sacrifices to be made. But we'll look at those in later videos and why you'd want to make the choices that you make. Let's move on to the next point of the triangle, and that is aperture. Now, the aperture of the lens, as I've said here, is the size of the hole through which the light is allowed to pass to the film or sensor. Now, this size can be varied, and on an SLR camera, it's typically adjusted. You'll have a ring that goes around the barrel of the lens. It's usually a sort of a knurled ring, a textured ring that goes around the barrel of the lens, and you can twist that in one direction to make the hole smaller, and in the other direction to open the aperture up. Digital models, though, quite often adjust electronically. There'll be a button on the body of the camera or a wheel on the body of the camera that you turn, so it's not normally on the barrel of the lens. Now, the difference in aperture settings, as I've said here, is measured in f-stops. We're going to take a look at these f-stops now. Here's a table of the standard f-stop settings, and you'll see they go from f1, f1.4, f2, f2.8, all the way up to f64 on this table. Now, here's the thing. There's a couple of things here that might take a little bit of getting used to. The first is, again, we have the doubling, or in this case, halving. So f1 to f1.4. f1.4 lets in half the amount of light that f1 lets in. f2 lets in half the amount of light that f4 lets in. At the other end of the scale, if we were moving down, f45 would let in twice as much light as f64, and f32 would let in twice as much light as f45. Now, here's the thing. You've probably noticed that although we've got the halving and doubling, the halving and doubling in the actual numbers takes place every other one. So you can see here we've got f1, and then it's actually 2 stops to f2. So you've actually gone 4 times. You're actually taking a quarter of the light. So it halves between f1 and f1.4 and halves again between f1.4 and f2. So it's actually a quarter of the light there. So, and that's true all the way up. You'll see that f1.4, you halve that, it becomes f2, and you halve it again, it becomes f2.8. 2.8 you'd think was twice 1.4. Doesn't quite work that way, but that's the scale. So a little bit confusing there. And the other thing that you need to remember is the higher you go up the scale, the less light you are letting in. So f1.4 lets in half as much as f1. Does that make sense? Not twice as much, half as much as f1. f2 lets in half as much as f1.4. All the way up. Each step going up the scale lets in half as much light as the previous stop. Each stop going down the scale lets in twice as much light as the stop higher above. Hope that makes sense. Now, here's the thing. Most often you will see and use lenses between f2 and f16. Now, the reason for that is, as I've said here, lenses below f2 tend to be very expensive. Very high quality lenses, very expensive, very desirable. If you see one that's going cheap, check out that it's working and in good working order and snap it up, provided it fits your camera, of course. But they tend to be expensive. At the other end of the scale, there is limited usefulness. We'll cover that in later videos as to why their usefulness is limited. But you will tend to suffer a degree of quality impairment higher up the scale. So usually you'll be operating in the f2 to f16 band. And a lot of photographers would work at f11 and below. Okay, so let's have a look at how that works in an actual lens. Here I've got one of my old Minolta lenses, and you can see here I'm twisting the ring. I've got some white card behind it. I'm twisting the ring. Do you see, as I stop down, so if at one end of the scale I'm going right down to f22, and at the other end it only opens as far as f3.5, this one. There you go. I've given you a view of the actual stops there. But as I turn it back over, you'll see what turning that ring does. So at that end we're at f3.5, right down to f22, up through all the stops, and back down again. Does that make sense? Okay, hope you've got that. Right, so that's ISO and aperture covered. We now need to look at the third point on the triangle, which is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed simply determines how long the light is allowed to pass through the lens aperture to the film. And again, we've got a table of standard shutter speeds. Normally, these are measured in fractions of a second, and we'll start at one end. In fact, there will typically be another setting on your camera that is the B setting. Now, B stands for bulb, and that actually will hold the shutter open for as long as the button is depressed. So it doesn't sort of click it open and shut very quickly. As you press the button, it opens the shutter, and it doesn't close it until you release the shutter. But for the purposes of this, we're talking about the timed shutter releases. So we've got here on this table 1 second, half a second, quarter a second, eighth of a second, 15th, 30th, 60th, 125th, 250th, 500th and 1,000th. Now, as you've probably already noticed, as we move along the scale, they halve. So half, a quarter, 1/8, and so on. So each step along the scale from left to right halves the amount of time the shutter remains open. And equally, as we move the other way along the scale, we're doubling the amount of time the shutter remains open, and obviously doubling the amount of light that's let through. As I've said here, faster and slower shutter speeds are available. These are the most common settings on the cameras that we're focusing on. On up-to-date digital SLRs, you'll find much faster shutter speeds than these. And indeed, longer shutter speeds, slower shutter speeds than these as well, and all have their place. But as we're concentrating on black and white film photography, and as they don't seem to be making many film cameras now, we're stuck with the ones that were made up until about 10 years ago, really. Okay, let's have a look at that triangle again. Remember, so we've got a situation whereby we have the three cardinal points, as it were. That we've got ISO, we've got shutter speed, and we've got aperture, and we've seen that each one affects the others. And if we make a change in one, we need to make at least a change in one of the others. And we'll have a look at an example of that in a second. So let's have a look. Here's the tables again. So we've got the main ISO ratings, we've got a standard f-stop setting, and we've got the standard shutter speeds. Now let's say the meter on your camera, and I'm assuming that the camera you have has metering on it, is, let's say you've loaded it with ISO 200 film, and the metering on your camera is saying that the correct exposure is f5.6 with 1/60th of a second. Now, let's say you decided that actually you wanted to open your aperture to a wider setting. Let's say you wanted to shoot the particular shot on f2, and we'll look in later videos as to why you might choose to do that. So the meter on your camera is telling you you should be using f5.6 at a 60th of a second, but you're saying, no, hang on a minute, I know what I'm doing here. I actually feel this shot would benefit from a wider aperture. And you say, I want f2. Well, we can see that's 1, 2, 3 stops along. Yeah? So if we're opening the aperture up, so thereby letting more light in, what do you think we need to do with this shutter speed? Well, obviously, we want to use a much faster shutter speed so that the light is allowed through for less time. So we know the amount of light we wish to let through in total. If we're using a wider aperture, we know that we need to leave it open for less time for the same amount of light to reach the film. So if we've counted 3 stops along on the f-stop setting, we need to count 3 stops along on the shutter speeds. 1, 2, 3. And so instead of f5.6 at 1/60th of a second, we'll use f2 at 1/500th of a second. Equally, if we'd moved in the other direction with the f-stop, we'd do exactly the same. So however many stops you move along on your f-stops, you move a similar amount along in the opposite direction on your shutter speeds. Hope that makes sense. And I'm going to step back out into the sunshine. Hey there, it's back to me in the garden here again. Hope you enjoyed that introduction to the basics of exposure. What we're going to look at in the next video is a little more in depth in the relationship between your shutter speed and your aperture, and when you should choose to prioritize one over the other, and the likely results you're going to get. And I'll see you again very soon.